October 8, 1871, the same night as the Great Chicago Fire. But while the world remembers Chicago, another firestorm in Wisconsin was far worse. In the small town of Peshtigo, flames roared like a hurricane, and within hours, thousands of lives were gone. This is the tragic tale of one of America's worst disasters, which almost nobody knows about. Welcome back to my channel. Today we'll travel to Peshtigo, Wisconsin, USA, on October 8, 1871. The wind was strong in the small town of Peshtigo. It was a typical day in the autumn of 1871, but what started as an ordinary day would soon turn into the stuff of nightmares. Now, a little over 2,000 people lived and worked in the town of Peshtigo, but that was just a small part of the population in the surrounding area. Thousands more worked in the logging camps nearby, where men chopped down trees all day long. Those trees were then taken to Peshtigo and sent further south to be used to build houses and barns and furniture. It had been a very dry season, and all that cut wood was very dry too, and those thousands of workers were now heading back to town after a hard day's work. They would gather in the evenings around the stores, bars and hotels and restaurants and the boarding houses, having just finished their shift in the woods. But as the evening wore on, many of them headed home. Families sat down to dinner, kids went to bed, and couples strolled along the streets. Most of the people in Peshtigo thought nothing of the two small fires that broke out in the forest that afternoon. After all, such fires were common. The men who had worked in the woods all day knew that most of the time they could be easily put out, but this time was different. As darkness fell over the town, the wind picked up and the two small fires that had broken out earlier were growing rapidly. People rushed to sound the alarm, and soon the whole town was shouting fire. Men, women, and children ran through the streets, banging pots and pans, trying to wake everybody up. Flames shot into the air, and people began to flee. It was too late to get out by road. The only way to escape was to run north into the woods, or south across the river. Many ran north, deep into the forest. But after a while, the forest floor became littered with charred bodies. Those people had nowhere to go. Others fled south across the river. Soon, however, they found the bridge was gone, collapsed by falling trees. Even those who tried to swim across the river did not make it. Trees fell into the river, blocking their path. Others were burned alive, floating corpses in the water. For many, there was simply no escape from the flames. By the next morning, entire towns and villages were wiped off the map. The fire had come and gone, and left behind a landscape that had been devastated. Homes, barns, mills, and whole neighborhoods were turned to ash. Everywhere people could be seen lying dead on the ground. Many had died trying to flee. Others had burned to death in their homes. Some had jumped into rivers, hoping to escape the flames, only to drown. When the smoke cleared, the horror of what had happened in Peshtigo became clear. More than 2,000 people had lost their lives in the fire, making this the deadliest wildfire in United States history. So how did this happen? How could a small town in Wisconsin be completely destroyed in just a few hours, and why have you never heard of it? Just a few days before the disaster, a cold front had moved across Wisconsin, bringing with it unseasonably dry and windy weather. The logging camps were particularly hard hit, and many of the men working there had been forced to take shelter from the high winds. On Sunday, October, some of these workers went outside to find that two small fires had broken out in the forest. These were quickly identified as being caused by carelessly discarded cigarettes, with hundreds of workers living in close proximity to each other in the camps. News of the fires spread quickly. Since everyone had been forced inside by the high winds, there was nowhere for the fires to spread. As the men stood around talking, they realized that if the wind should suddenly change direction, the fires could easily spread and engulf the whole forest. And since the forest was filled with logs left over from their work, the fires could easily spread at a frightening rate. But no one thought much of it until that night, when the two small fires suddenly exploded into a huge firestorm. By the time people realized what was happening, it was too late. Now, we don't know exactly what happened that night, but what we do know is that a storm had swept across the state, carrying with it winds of up to 60 miles per hour. These winds fanned the flames, causing them to spread rapidly through the dry forest. In less than an hour, the whole forest was ablaze. It has been suggested that at one point, the fire even created its own tornado, which added to the destruction. Witnesses later reported seeing a column of fire rising into the sky, stretching for miles. At its base was a funnel of flame that reached down from the top of the fire and spun around, carrying burning debris with it. This fire tornado raced across the land, devouring everything in its path. Some survivors claimed that the heat from the fire was so intense that people burst into flames as they ran. Others said that they could hear screams in the forest as people burned to death. To make matters worse, the fire was accompanied by thick black smoke that blocked out the sun and made it difficult to see. This meant that people were often unable to escape the flames until it was too late. As the fire swept through the towns, it seemed as though nothing could stop it. People desperately ran for the hills or jumped into rivers, hoping to escape the flames, only to be burned alive in the water. Others hid in wells, hoping to survive by sheltering in place. But the fire was simply too intense. Even today, more than 150 years later, charred bones can be found in those wells. Many of the people who survived the initial outbreak of the fire did not realize that the river was blocked by fallen trees and debris, so they jumped into the river and drowned. Others were burned to death as they tried to swim across. One survivor recalled what he saw later. "I want to tell you how terrible it was. First came the crackling of the flames, then a loud roar as of a heavy wind. Then came a wall of fire rolling along the ground toward us, sweeping all before it. People screamed as they were caught and burned to death. Others ran wildly around, desperately seeking safety. Some fell to their knees and others threw themselves into the river, only to be caught and burned to death in the water. But somehow, the small town of Peshtigo wasn't the worst hit. In fact, it was one of the luckier places to be, because the firestorm also engulfed the town of Seymour, Wisconsin, which was just south of Peshtigo. Almost the entire town of Seymour was destroyed, and more than 400 people died. But the death toll in Peshtigo was still tragically high. Historians believe that between 1,700 and 2,500 people lost their lives that night in Wisconsin. Why have you never heard of it? Well, it's because the fire happened on the same night as the Great Chicago Fire. Everyone forgets about the Peshtigo Fire, which is a shame because it was even more deadly than the Chicago Fire, killing more than 5 times as many people. The reason for that is pretty simple. Chicago was a bigger city, and it's much easier to get people interested in something if the place that burns down is full of celebrities and important people. There were no celebrities in Peshtigo for a long time. The people who lived through the fire didn't even want to talk about it. They felt that if they talked about it, the pain would be too great. It was only in recent years that historians have begun to uncover the truth about what happened that night. We may never know exactly what caused the fire, but we do know that it was a freak event that could have been avoided. If the workers in the logging camps had been able to contain the 2 small fires that broke out earlier, the whole thing might have been avoided. The Peshtigo Fire of 1871 was more than a blaze. It was a hurricane of fire. A tragedy that killed thousands, yet was overshadowed by another city's flames. The night the earth itself seemed to burn. Thank you for watching.